Las plantas son unos seres vivos autótrofos, que quiere
Plants are
decir que
autotrophic
producen su
living
propio
beings.
alimento.
What does that
Resulta
mean?
que las plantas son los
They
únicos
produce
seres
their
vivos
own
que son
food.
capaces
It turns out that plants are the only living beings that are able to synthesize the sun's energy, carbon dioxide, the nutrients that are in the soil, turn them into sugars to be able to have their food. Plants have been doing that for many years, even more years than we have been on the planet, but it is clear that plants make it easier for us beings that need oxygen to live to have such a complex form. What does this mean? That without plants living things would be molecules and would be algae and would be say still beings, beings very similar to them. What do plants do? When they do all their breathing system, they take the CO2 molecule and take the water, separate these molecules, and they in the process of breathing oxygen left over, the oxygen molecule is left over. That's what they vote for. That's why, for example, our planet looks blue. Because of that process that plants do, they throw away all that oxygen. That oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere, becomes ozone, and that's why the planet looks blue from space. We also owe the blue sky to the whole process that plants do. Speaking of all plants, they are the beginning and the end of the whole cycle of life that is part of this system that is the planet. Then they are beings, as I said, the main ones, the protagonists of this story that we are going to start talking about. Plants, they need 4 basic characteristics, or they have 4 basic needs to subsist. Like all living things, they need light, because all that energy is what they have to transform all the molecules that come to them, and to be able to create their own food. They need air, because that's where they get the CO2, that's where they make that separation, that's where our oxygen comes from, that's what we need to live. And the soil is like the plate. What plants do is, their roots are little peeps that absorb water and absorb all the nutrients that they manage to solubilize in the soil. Natural soils have many nutrients. They have macronutrients and micronutrients. They normally have nitrogen, the macro elements that are nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. They consume them in large quantities because they are the basic elements that they need, and the others are required depending on the needs, especially for growth, for flowering, for fruit production, for the production of fruits, for flowering, for fruit production. So basically the plants, where we always want to have them, which is where we are going to start talking about biophilia. When we have the plants in the house, we have to provide them with these same characteristics. So we have to provide them with water, light, and we have to provide them with a soil so that they have nutrients. Plants are also magical in the subject of adaptation. The living beings that have suffered more processes in evolution to adapt to the circumstances are precisely the plants. It happens, it takes much more time than, for example, an animal to adapt, because they do not have the facility to move quickly, for example, to take shelter from excessive winds. But plants throughout history and in their evolution have been adapting to the conditions. A very obvious example of this are the epiphytes. The epiphytes are plants that many years ago were born in the interior of the forest, as we see in this point, which is the tropical forest of the garden, in the lower part of the forest, which is called undergrowth. Some plants were born. What happened? The forest started to become denser, darker, and these plants needed more light. What did they do? They started to climb the trees and to look for light in the upper areas. These are the epiphyte plants. So this is a great example of the evolution and the levels of adaptation. All living beings, when we have to adapt, we modify the main structures of survival. We modify them to be able to adapt to the conditions. Plants do the same, but they do it in a longer period of time. To say something, they begin to appear some very cool features of adaptation, and the plants that had to grow in darker areas, as the pigments that have more facility to capture little light are red. Those plants began to generate red colorations, of course, because they have to capture more light than those that are exposed. The plants, for example, that began to be too exposed to the sun, they are modifying their structures over time to adapt. The same happens with climate change. At this moment the process of climate change is much faster than their ability to adapt. What they have sold us all is, we do not have to take care of the planet. The planet finally, after we are gone, will have its evolution, and the plants will adapt to that system of life. Those who will not be able to adapt are us. Biophilia is not a true science. That's the first thing to say. There is no studied science called biophilia. It is a term that is being given now very recently to what we have been doing for many years, which is landscaping. So what is biophilia? If we go to the syntax of the word, biophilia is love of life, love of life. But biophilia in natural systems, everything is cyclical and everything is related. That is, there is always a relationship of coevolution between all living things. Plants need animals, animals need plants, humans need plants, humans need living things. But biophilia in natural systems, everything is cyclical and everything is related. There is always a relationship of coevolution between all living things. Plants need animals, animals need plants. Human beings have, since we are born, an innate connection to these natural systems as well. That's why we have the need in the city to have parks, to have gardens, to buy the plant and put it in the dining room in the house. That innate connection that all living beings have. That's why we like to have pets. That's why we like to see birds. All that connection is biophilia, is what defines those connections. Then for plants, pollinators, and us, biophilia is trying to represent natural spaces. To say something like that, in a non-natural space, to take these same plants to a house, what should one do there? To be very coherent with those characteristics, to have more or less the same light, to have the same availability of water, and that we can supply them with some nutrients in the soil or in the pot, almost to trace the natural sites so that the plants can be in the spaces where we can have that interaction. The subject of landscaping has had a very interesting evolution. Before, when the term of gardening and landscaping came to Colombia, it was a very ornamental subject. It was basically copying the European gardens, which is what we had as in the imaginary of the gardens, the candle pines, the square hedges gardens, everything perfect. It also has to do with landscaping, and gardening in Colombia is closely linked to botany. Why? Because in Colombia we are a privileged country due to the position we have on the planet. We are very close to the zero line of the equator, which has important geomorphological conditions for there to be a great biodiversity. In fact, this is the area where there is more biodiversity on the planet, and Colombia is also the second planet that has more species per hectare in the world. Colombia is the second most biodiverse planet. The first would be Brazil, but it is by proportion, because if Colombia were the size of Brazil, it would be more biodiverse. In Colombia we have the advantage that we have a large number of botanists, a large number of people who study botany and who study landscaping from science. Initially in these countries and in Colombia, landscaping began to be done, more copying the theme of European ornament, the castles and all that, and we finally understood that the gardens For the same reason that I was talking about just now, because biophilia is a theme of interconnection, of coevolution, the gardens have to become part of that same system. When we landscapers make gardens, we have to be very conscious of our biotic situation. What that means, we have to first study the space where these species evolved in order to be able to recreate it in the best way and not interrupt those perfect cycles that exist in all ecosystems.
En la biofilia o en paisajismo, la mayoría de los errores que se han cometido o hemos cometido han sido por
In biophilia or in landscaping, most of the mistakes that have been made or we have made have been due to ignorance. What happens, that botany and landscaping, and at this time the biophilia, is a science that will always be under study. There is no ultimate answer, certain that one says exactly is this. Even the species, genera, the scientific name of the plant still change a lot, and it is because botanists, as this is such a mysterious world, are just researching. For example, in the city of Medellin we had many years introducing species. We even began to replace native species by introduced species, and it turns out that this is a very mysterious world. For example, in the city of Medellin we have been introducing species for many years. We even began to replace native species with introduced species, and it turns out that this is a big mistake because what we are doing is completely breaking the cycle of connection, which is the important thing in biophilia. After many years, after many mistakes that we have made, for example, from the botanical garden we carried out a very important task. More or less 8 years ago we were repopulating with native species in the city of Medellin. In that step there were many mistakes that at that moment we are correcting, and in those mistakes that were made of introducing plants that were possibly more beautiful to our taste, but less important for the ecosystem, they have been more important for the ecosystem. The process of biophilia is really all that, we are all adapting. All living beings, humans, animals, plants, we are all adapting in a cycle that is also important, because it is like the beginning of the end of the whole living system that is the planet. When we talk about biophilia, let's say in terms of the relationship between animals and plants, we always talk about pollinators, because that is what groups them together, but really it is all the animals that interact, because there are animals that visit plants to perch, others visit them because they make their nests there, others visit them for courtship. There are some pollinators that we are talking about: bees, some beetles, some mockingbirds, butterflies, but there are also the seed dispersers that are the birds that are very important, the opossum, that is the butterfly, of some coleoptera, some cockroaches, butterflies, but there are also seed dispersers that are birds that are very important, the opossum, which is a marsupial that is very important in this tropical zone. Then the relationship is of all animals with everything, even, for example, as simple as the caterpillar feeds on certain plants. After that caterpillar, when it becomes a butterfly, the butterfly feeds on certain plants, the butterfly feeds on nectar but from other plants. It's a dynamic relationship between the whole living system. One always talks about pollinators, but really seed dispersers, for perching, for nesting, for protection. Really the interaction is complete. In other words, all animals have to do with the same living system that they have in the immediate environment, let's say, close by. Everything depends on each one of those links working perfectly. And if we in the beginning, let's say in the special food plant for the caterpillar, we change the native plants for the caterpillars here and we put plants from another space, immediately we cut that connection, the system is complete. They all communicate with each other at different levels, but it has to work completely for it to be circular, which is how our planet works. In any space, what we must do initially is to make a reading of the availability of resources, as we have been talking about throughout the program. To make biophilia, the first thing we must do is to make resources available to recreate that natural space for the plants, the living system that we are going to develop. a lot of typologies begin to appear. There are butterfly host gardens where special plants are planted to attract butterflies, special plants are planted so that there is food available for caterpillars, special plants are planted to make food available for the caterpillars, nutritious species are planted and nectariferous species are called that way. There we go back to the same thing, biophilia and life is a cyclical theme. Species are planted where the butterfly lays its eggs, the caterpillar hatches and eats the whole plant, and then it makes its metamorphosis process. The butterfly hatches and that butterfly feeds on the nectar of the flowers of other plants. That's why in a system like the tropics it is not normal to plant species of a single species. That is why we here have begun to understand that we have a lot of availability and the least natural thing in this system are monocultures, because what monocultures do is that, they cut all these cycles because of what I was telling you more or less about butterflies. Butterflies in their complete life cycle being caterpillars and being butterflies need two types of plants. If we plant only one, they do not reach the caterpillar. By studying all these spaces is that one defines the garden trends. For example, it begins to appear the edible gardens, is a new trend in urban agriculture. It is simply the planting of species of agriculture or human consumption as species that are planted in gardens or aromatic or edible flowers and are integrated into non-traditional gardens. Why? Because the edible species are species of less duration in time, normally they are not perennial, that is to say that they do not last many years. One would have if one has had at some point the possibility of having a garden, that every 3 months you practically have to replant. The idea of these gardens again in the tropics is to make a completely diverse set where these spaces are filled in a natural way. But there always has to be a balance. At this point a fourth system appears, which is the gray infrastructure that finally is a system that is part of our whole context, in the search for all these spaces for landscaping, to make gardens and obviously increasingly reduced by the growth of cities, began to develop new technologies that are green roofs and vertical gardens. The vertical gardens were really born in Europe. They had to solve some synthetic systems, where they generate a synthetic soil of fibers and there they supply the nutrients by a hydroponic system. Really the vertical systems, the vertical gardens were born being completely hydroponic systems, in places where there is not the facility to have soil or land for the plants to grow. For me it is a theme that becomes very repetitive and our commitment is supremely great. We landscapers, botanists, even educators and all those who have to do with this natural theme, first is to recognize that we have an important biotic condition. We are part of the environment where we exist and in the same way we alter it or benefit it. Many years ago the human being was seen as outside of the systems. As if this is the natural system and here I am. No. We are part of the same thing. That is why it is biophilia. The idea is to understand that we are a whole system, that we are interconnected. Our main commitment is to understand that we are part of a system, that we are not giving instructions so that it works like that because it has a perfect cycle that works if we follow exactly that cycle. It is simply to know. I say that the main challenge and the main mission of landscapers is to know the space that you are inhabiting and what you are going to intervene. If we know, we study. I am going to give you an example. We have a human being that was born in a desert and we come and throw him into a wasteland. He dies after 2 days. He can obviously adapt, but he needs some processes, so that is what it is, like knowing the environment where he comes from and where we are going to take him. I think that would be a solution to all the problems that we have is to feel inside, to respect it and to know it initially to be able to make a decision.
Sentirnos adentro, respetarlo y conocerlo inicialmente para poder tomar algunas decisiones. Para resumir, como todo el tema de la biofilia, es importante.
To summarize, as the whole issue of biophilia, it is important to first recognize ourselves as part of that whole ecosystem. Recognize that it is also not a science that is already studied and that we are going to find in a dictionary the definition, and that is, no, gardens, natural systems, landscapes are always changing. You're never going to have an exact picture of the system. Because there is life, and life is precisely that, it's a constant change of all the factors that bring together and simply summarize so that there is life. That's the magic of gardens, to let things happen, to let some plants be more beautiful, others more ugly, to let mosses appear, to let fungi appear. The magic of gardens is to let things happen, to let life flow and pass. The gardens, sometimes it is a complex issue with clients because when someone pays to have a space made, they would like to see it as a painting exactly like the way they painted it, but normally the theme of landscapers is to give them all this information, to make them fall in love with the systems we have. The gardens have to be ornamental, they have to be aesthetic, and they have to be liked by the observer, because gardens are beautiful because of the observer, so they have to fulfill that function, but they also have to fulfill an ecosystem function. I have always said that when I make gardens, I am making a work. I do not consider myself an artist, but I make works of art. They are 3D paintings. For me, biophilia is all those implements that make it easier for me to make that work of art, which I know is changing. For me, it is the love of anything, the love of the fungus, the love of all the processes of the soil, the love of plants, of the changes even to plants that are not so beautiful. It is more love to understand what is happening in our living system. That is for me biophilia.
Eso es para mí la biofilia.